I'm Nick Riley from Sustainable X, and welcome to this webinar with our sustainable expert on EPR today, who's Mark Sayers. So Sustainable X, we help businesses focus on what matters and do well from doing good. And in terms of what matters, a common theme for a lot of businesses is what are the resources and materials used in the products and packaging which they use and sell. And legislation has kicked in this space. So it's becoming more and more important. So there's business benefits from reducing resource or for increasing resource reductions in itself, but there's now a legislation aspect where there's money changes hands for lessening that load. So, Mark, would you like to introduce yourselves as our sustainable expert on this subject? So, sustainable experts, whenever something goes into depth and specialist knowledge is required, we have a range of experts, and Mark is our expert on this topic.
Great. Yeah, so hello. Thanks, Nick, for inviting me along to share with you a bit about some of my work within packaging legislation. So I'm Mark Sayers. I'm Director of Circumetrics. It's an independent consulting firm focusing on extended producer responsibility and circular economy. What that means in this context today is about packaging, packaging sustainability, packaging recycling, packaging waste, but we're going to focus on talking about the new UK packaging regulations, which have been proving quite a burden for most companies, both those who know about it, and it's sort of a bit of a blind spot for a number of others who don't really haven't really got to grips with it yet. So I'll be sharing a little bit of an insight on that today.
Perfect. So in simple terms, what is EPR and why is it important for UK businesses?
So EPR, Extended Producer Responsibility, it's to do with placing responsibility on the producers of products and materials which are placed on the market and making them ultimately legally and financially responsible for when it reaches the end of its life. The name of it is a little bit misleading, if I'll be honest with you. Packaging waste regulations. Everybody thinks, well, I don't have enough packaging to hit the thresholds, but actually it's to do with everything which goes through the business under some predetermined activities. Now, it has changed in the last couple of years. So 2023 regs were issued, and this is what's proving quite a challenge for businesses to reform their compliance systems, which they may have had in place for almost 2 decades. And the kind of work I've been doing most recently is all about updates and trying to get companies aware of what the new legislation means.
Okay, so if a business is thinking, geez, this could be me, what sort of materials or sectors are most likely to be affected by the new EPR regs?
Yeah, so the new regs really have taken a completely different approach to how it places responsibility on companies. The targets really are for those who are involved in the manufacture of packaging itself. You have brands, so brand holders, where their name is actually on the packaging, and those who are supplying to users, typically retailers, is the biggest kind of target market there. So they're the kind of 3 groups. But when it comes to the actual, when we think of sectors in industry context, it could be anything. Because if you think about it, pretty much everything has packaging around it. So it's all performing that function, and they could all potentially be affected, providing that they meet some of the thresholds. I'm just going to share with you a quick illustration to kind of visualize that, because it's quite complicated when we start to try and measure this. But the 2 factors which are used to determine whether a company is affected are turnover, so the whole year's sales, which they submit through their accounts, and also the tonnage of packaging which they're handling. And this is the tricky bit, quantifying that correctly, both in the eyes of the legislation and the various supply chains which businesses operate. So you can see there's quite a few different levels here, but it's these which are in the small producer and large producer who are the companies who are affected. And the lowest end of that is looking at a minimum of 25 tons of packaging going through the business and greater than £1 million turnover in the course of a year. So depending on how you measure that, that can be quite a few sales to kind of measure that, but working out some quick averages should be relatively straightforward to understand where they are on that threshold point. But the activities part is where it starts to get a little bit tricky, and trying to understand brand holders, which you're responsible for, any packaging which you're introducing, packaging which you're selling in the sense where your customers are removing it, the kind of typical points where companies are starting to struggle. And then as we dive deeper into the legislation, there's other interpretations to do with whether your supplier or your customer is large or small, and how that responsibility may ultimately sit with your business as opposed to their business. And determining which side of the line that sits can prove quite difficult because of the way the interpretations are made.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it is. It's tricky, and when we work with some clients, in terms of getting to grips with it, different people can interpret it in different ways, and that's a risk, right? So,
Yeah, definitely.
and in terms of the process with EPR now, I'm aware it's there are some deadlines have already landed. What does that landscape look like in terms of compliance? If people haven't started, are they behind the, are they in trouble?
Yeah, well, I mean, the main deadlines that we look at under the new latest legislation, we have an April deadline and an October deadline, and it's all to do with data reporting. So companies have to do a huge amount of work to get that information together to quantify the amount of packaging which they're responsible for. And the importance of that data is because it determines how much they're going to pay. So they'll be paying either through the PAC UK compliance organisation, which accounts for household packaging, or they may have joined a compliance scheme where they'll be paying money to them for the recycling side of their responsibilities, where the actual waste is processed by facilities. So we have April and October as a deadline. Those numbers are really, really important because they determine cost. But the biggest headache businesses are facing at the moment is the new data reporting, which fits in with the October deadline, but it's to do with a recyclability assessment. And that essentially grades packaging on a red, amber, or green based on how recyclable that material is. So instead of one set of data, which says my total volume of packaging going through the business is 1,000 tons in the course of the last 6 months, because we're doing the reporting twice yearly, we have to have three sets of that. One which says the quantity of red graded packaging, which is the least typically non-recyclable, amber, which is recyclable in some instances, or green, which is widely recyclable at scale. So that has suddenly triplicated the amount of effort when it comes to meeting those deadlines.
And what sort of risks are we talking here if you ignored it? Are you what sort of fineage or consequences would there be?
Well, this has always been the stick end of the system. The policy, the legislation does allow for penalties, prosecutions of businesses, and it can be severe. It's always linked to how big of a evasion of the legislation or cost saving which they would have made were they not registered and reporting that data. So there's some pretty big financial fines which can be implemented by the regulators, the various agencies in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. Now, we can look to case history as to how big that can be. And in some cases, we're talking like over £400,000 for some pretty big organizations with a number of years where they've been found to be non-compliant with this legislation. But the process isn't to go through that. There are ways of mitigating it and keeping it out of the courts through a mechanism called civil sanctions. And essentially, it's still a black mark of sorts against the company, but it avoids the kind of legal records of going through the court system for non-compliance penalties.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, and in terms of the data side of things, and you've mentioned in there the triplication, and how accurate does that need to be, and what sort of challenges do business face in terms of getting that data if they haven't been measuring that before? So we know some businesses who are below the threshold and they don't measure this in any way, shape, or form yet. But if they go over the threshold, suddenly there's a whole level of systems that they just haven't got yet.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we find with so many companies. They're experts in what's in the box. But when it comes to measuring the box, unless you're a packaging manufacturer, of course, unless you're in that situation, that they're really clued up on what's within the box. But the box around it and the information which exists there is often quite difficult to obtain. There may be some minimum dimension information type available, but retrieving that is a bit of a hybrid task. Some of it's delivered through in-house measurement, and some of it's can be gathered through supplier engagement. But any company who looks at their product portfolio, it always looks like a rather daunting task when you look at the number of SKUs. So the way I typically work with companies is to try and section that out so we can get as accurate as reasonably possible data for different product categories. So if you have 100,000 products, we don't necessarily have to go out and retrieve data for 100,000 different items. We try and section or categorize those products into a more manageable system, and then we can start to tackle how do we attribute data to each of those in the right way, because it isn't necessary to go out and stick every item, every component on a set of scales, but it does require a reliable and robust methodology behind the calculation of that data, again, to meet audit criteria from the agencies. But ultimately, the concern of the business is getting it accurate enough so you're not paying more than you need to.
Yeah. And there's also a challenge if people are exporting. So there are different rules in the market they're exporting to. Is that right?
Yeah, so if we look at the UK regs, exports don't feature within the cost base for that because the material and the product is going elsewhere. But then when you look at the market it's going to, they will most likely have a equivalent set of legislations or regulations, laws, depending on what whether it's member state in the EU or further afield. More and more countries are adopting this EPR policy, so they'll have their own laws. And where you do have either distance selling, where you're selling to a user in another country, often through e-commerce type routes, there could be responsibilities of the same nature, but of other policies, other laws in other countries. So understanding a little bit about your supply chain for export shipments is really important to make sure you don't have a blind spot for a legal requirement in another country under a completely different set of laws.
Gotcha. I didn't mention to anyone who's listening, if you've got any questions, just stick them in the Q&A and we will answer them. But in the absence of that, we'll carry on with the conversation. But in terms of, so on that data piece, and then the scenario I have where a company, they haven't been measuring anything before, systems wise, tools wise, is there things on the market they should look at, or is it something you should develop in house? What's out there?
Well, data is, as companies will appreciate more and more, the lifeblood of what they do. Whether that's selling and designing their own products, managing their finances, it's becoming an increasing important part of how they operate. So I suppose we see various models in how businesses have tried to comply with the regulations, and I'll give you some across the spectrum examples, from the very basic Excel spreadsheet, which kind of plunks its way along, and where you've got smaller organizations where there's not as much complexity, sometimes that can work. Then in the middle, you can start to have a bit more of a bespoke approach, a little bit more tailored to what the individual organization is doing. I work with some partners who have software tools to help with the recyclability assessment data, because that's becoming a bigger data management exercise, whereby it's building that portfolio of packaging information through various means of data collection, in-house records, and categorization. So that's kind of like the midway stage. And then you have the top end, which is very sophisticated, typically bolt-on tools to things like SAP, which many businesses have incorporated within their stock management or finance systems, with a very one size fits all kind of bolt on. Sometimes it works well, sometimes it's a bit bent and stretched beyond the intended function, but there are some pretty advanced bolt on tools out there which companies can use. So with those kind of three different models, they're all trying to achieve the same thing, which is develop a reliable methodology, which is audit ready or audit proof, to be able to generate these data reports on a twice yearly basis, so that companies can meet those regulation deadlines and have a greater understanding of what it's going to cost them, and the insights, hopefully, which some of that data can potentially provide. Again, if you're talking in the middle or upper options there, the availability to understand why does it cost me this many tens of £1,000s to comply, and understanding which product or which material is causing you the greatest pain from cost. And then what you can do is then go back and say, well, how do we mitigate that? Why do the regulations penalize me on this one? And then we start to look forward about change, redesign, or understanding how to minimize that cost.
And in terms of where the regs are, obviously it's the packaging focus now. Do you foresee this might start to apply to products as well? So, if people are having a bit of a look ahead, what do you see coming sort of 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, if taking a step back from the kind of immediate packaging space, policymakers essentially are using this EPR tool for problem waste streams. Is a simple way to look at it. So if there's a challenge or a lost resource, because this is all within the context of circular economy, the materials which go into things we make, use, consume, eat, etc., how do they recover more of that or maximize the value of it? It's about the policy tools which they use within this producer responsibility model is definitely being adopted more widely. We already have legislation for electronics products, batteries, vehicles, and hopefully or imminently we'll expect to see more within the apparel and textile space. And that those four plus packaging five are some of the priority areas which governments and policymakers across Europe have said there's a huge amount of material and resource going into these things. We need to be more conscious of how do we not just bury it in landfill, burn it in an incineration, and essentially lose the value in that commodity. And the producer responsibility tool is encouraging business to think more about both what goes into the product at the beginning, i.e., design, and about how they capture that at a greater rate for recycling type activities or even reuse and refurbishment type activities, which essentially is keeping it in a closer circle for using that material in its form again and again.
Yeah, and that sort of naturally leads on to thinking on it from a wider business perspective, where can this actually be a business advantage in addressing it and not just a cost?
Yeah, so you'll hear it time and time again, but the sustainability focus of businesses and consumers is increasing. And there is a huge opportunity to both capitalize on that increased desire of your customers, also to support their own sustainability ambitions beyond that of just looking at packaging and waste. Net zero ambitions, waste features within that, packaging features within that, it's all a contributor to a business's footprint. So having the regulation as a mandatory driver is one step towards that. Then having the data behind that to validate and quantify some of those impacts or reductions which businesses are making. It's helping them to kind of build a stronger picture and a stronger value proposition within this space of both compliance. They know they're buying from a compliant organization, but also there's potential to align that with their customers' own sustainability ambitions. And having the information behind that makes that possible to join the dots together there and potentially offer a greater value to the customers.
And any examples of sort of practical examples where businesses have actually used EPR to develop some sort of innovation or build that customer trust?
Yeah, I think the best examples within this are to do with the collaborations between material collectors and manufacturers. Unilever is a good one where they started to try and incorporate more recycled content into their plastic packaging for their household products. It's driven partly by, policy always has a factor within this, but there's also a market driver that it's advantageous for them to take greater control of their sourcing and supply. And it's a good example of kind of bringing that waste back into the manufacture process to then put into a new product. Glass bottles has always been one which has been very close because we have glass infrastructure within the UK for both the collection and then the remelting and then the remanufacturing within this country. It's a tricky time at the moment for them, but again, it's these examples of circular stories which you can demonstrate where it does work. And the driver for those companies who are designing the packaging or supplying the packaging is that they can source material from known suppliers in this kind of circular model and then use that to their advantage to meet their customers' ambitions and their customers' goals, where they're trying to demonstrate that they're being more environmentally conscious. They're able to attract that type of buyer who is conscious about the impact that they're having of buying those products and choosing one brand over another. It can always help to kind of build that stronger case and value proposition.
Yeah, no, you mentioned Unilever. Unilever had some fantastic innovation success stories, but there's some cautionary tales in there in terms of that. Some years ago, they did deodorant, and they managed to reduce the packaging size and get it all down, and it was a slam dunk. This is great. But when they put it on the shelf, obviously the
Yeah.
consumers all thought, well, this is just less value for me, and so it didn't fly. So they really
Yeah.
need the whole market to go there at once if it was going to work, and it didn't work. So an example of potentially collaboration required sometimes as well.
Yeah.
So on the whole exercise here, there's a bit of overlap with them because some people are being forced down the sort of traceability route for products for other reasons, for environmental reasons, for modern slave labor reasons, biodiversity, whatever it
Mm.
is. In terms of in doing this exercise, is there an opportunity to kill a few? That's the wrong language. Kill some birds with one stone. That's not very sustainable. But is there an opportunity to get better bang for your buck in the exercise? Does that make sense?
Yeah, again, it's having that mindset for the to remove those silos from within organizations when they're trying to achieve compliance for their particular regulatory task within the business. Um, the ticking the box to comply is the kind of bare minimum. They have to do that, but the value in the time they spend on that, the cost they ultimately pay for most of these kind of financially driven fiscal tools and policies, which are encouraging businesses to change, if there's great opportunity for greater alignment with other targets, both with those which are mandatory as well as those which are in the voluntary space, where the industry initiatives, Plastic Pact has been a big one, which has seen a lot of big brands kind of sign up to that, trying to focus in on how do they reduce the amount of plastic
Mm.
packaging they're using. Um, carbon footprinting and other supply chain, origins, looking at distance traveled, who's a supplier, whether they're in areas of conflict or supply risk. What all this is building layer upon layer of data on a tangible item, which is they're either partly responsible for, or at least it's going through their hands or their business operations. And essentially, it's kind of joining those different individuals within an organization who are involved in different aspects, looking at social aspects, looking at environmental impacts, looking at footprinting and carbon implications, looking at packaging weights, looking at plastic tax and recyclability, recycled content. It's simply just building a portfolio of information on that product or that component, and thinking about those different layers. Because when you bring it together, a lot of that information will need to come from external sources.
Mm.
So going to your supplier and asking them 6 different times by 6 different colleagues from your organization, it just creates more work for everybody. So where there's more of a coordinated approach considered for these other themes, which one organization probably has some accountability for, and that's before we even consider what your customers ask. So the kind of like cascading customer asks the supplier after the supplier. Having that wider consideration of what your own business is doing internally, first of all, then followed by what do my customers are doing in these themes, these topics, these kind of broader sustainability agenda which they're working towards. What does that look like? And how do we start to kind of build those layers into one program? And then we can start to attribute data and information to all of that. So when we do start to gather it, it is more of a holistic, coordinated approach. And then because it is more joined up, it offers more value both to within the organization for what they're trying to achieve, but then communicating that much more effectively to the customers and the customer's customer, which means that when they do come to you, they know that you're a more trusted supplier and able to retrieve that information more timely and more confident that the information you are providing is reliable and robust for their needs, because they probably have their own long list of sustainability metrics which they're trying to report against as well. So it just kind of continues. It's taking this more joined up approach and making it a much more robust and reliable reporting system.
And so, from experience, when you reach out to suppliers, it's not necessarily easily forthcoming the data, and it sort of leads us into the whole area of challenges in doing these things. What do you find in terms of the reach out to suppliers? What sort of engagement do you get? What level of cajoling is needed?
It can be quite different, if I'm honest with you. There are those who will bend over backwards to meet my clients' kind of needs when they say, "Can you give me more information about the origins of this?" or give me some sort of proof of certification for recycled content. It can differ quite a lot, but the greatest challenge is the knowledge gap. Whether you don't understand what or why, that makes the whole process a lot more slower and also less reliable. So quite often we find that training is really lacking in a lot of organizations because the roles which you're typically looking at are procurement and sales. They're not immediately at the forefront of thinking about sustainability. And
Mm,
that's where we kind of need to kind of think about this kind of more joined up approach, teams collaborating together to understand the needs which customers have and the kind of information which sits within the business to make that more to flow more easily, and also in a way in which those who aren't in this day in, day out, they actually can comprehend it and communicate it clearly. So
mm.
yes, supplier data gathering is difficult. Trying to systemize it through data management tools is a step forward, but also just simply the knowledge and understanding of those individuals involved in it, upping that a level, really does help.
Yeah. And so in implementing this, I guess people naturally do make mistakes and things happen. What are the sort of common bloopers you see where people are actually setting themselves back unintentionally?
Yeah, so if I mean, I'll talk to packaging and the UK regs on this just because most experience with how companies trip over themselves. I'd say the biggest ones are blind spots, and the second one is misinterpretations. So blind spots are, not necessarily through intentional, but just kind of gaps in a diverse operation of a business. Again, we're coming back to probably one or two people ultimately trying to quantify all of these activities and these materials, and not simply knowing what's happening at facility A in another location or a warehouse B, how they're operating on a day-to-day basis. If they decided to start buying new extra packaging to ship goods out, and if that isn't built into a standard operating procedure, well, it's not going to get counted because it's not all joined up. So there's kind of like blind spots as to what's happening across the organization. And then also with those blind spots, things don't change. Businesses are very dynamic in how they operate from one year to the next. And even though we've moved from once a year reporting under the old system to this twice a year reporting under the new regulations, there's still plenty of change happening. So what we determine is those standard operating or standard compliance procedures, they do need a more regular review to prevent those blind spots coming up, and whether that's under or over reporting. And the second point is to do with interpretations. Although the new legislation has moved the responsibility to more of a single point of responsibility, i.e. a single business in the value chain accounting for that packaging, there's a lot more complicated interpretations to try and make on where businesses are and are not responsible. And particularly because this is still new, there's still plenty of businesses out there grappling with it, even though they've been watching it for the last 5 or so years evolve and had a year's data reporting under their belt. There's still challenges there. And that's even before we start to talk about brand new businesses who either new startups, just crossing the thresholds, or simply didn't know about it, trying to get up to speed under a new system, or even the established businesses are still working to find their feet. That can be a real challenge. And it's about kind of taking this big hodgepodge of different legislation, requirements, different data reporting metrics, and trying to kind of like sift out what's relevant, because it is very big and complex. But when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of it, there are only probably a few which are really critical to an organization, and honing the effort in on those can have a more material impact on whether you're paying too much or too little.
Gotcha. So if you're on the cusp of thinking EPR may apply, or you're behind the curve, what's the message to businesses? What's the one big thing everybody should do now to prepare for EPR?
Well, the first thing is talk to people internally. Trying to tackle this on your own is going to prove more difficult. There's probably bits of information scattered across the organization, but bringing that all together and then doing some rough calculations on how much you think is going through the business to see where you are threshold wise. And then if that's for companies who aren't familiar with it, where we have businesses who are familiar with the legislation, I'd say it's more about making sure you do have the audit ready type methodologies in place. And also looking ahead, we have, this new recyclability data reporting, which businesses should have been working on for a month or so now, but only have until around September before the October deadline to complete those reports. That is another step change in data reporting. So if you're already in the system, start to think about how do I meet this extra reporting requirement to do with recyclability? Because there's 4 or 5 parameters which are definitely going to be out of your comfort zone of how you would traditionally quantify packaging to be able to meet that new regulatory requirement. And the implications of getting that wrong are a plus 20% increase in your already increased baseline costs for this because of the penalty system which is being applied to the red classified packaging. And if you don't have the data, coming back to the point about you need to have information, you don't have that data, default is red. Default is a plus 20% increase on your baseline costs, which are hundreds of pounds per ton already.
Yeah. Blimey. So, well, brilliant, Mark. That's excellent. Thank you very much for all your insights. And if anyone wants to know more, feel free to get in touch through Sustainable X or contact Mark directly. And I'm sure we'd all be delighted to help. So thanks, Mark. And I think we'll end the event there. And hopefully that's been useful to everybody who's been listening.
Thanks, Vic.